So hello once again and good afternoon everyone, or as we say it in the Philippines, magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Welcome to today's webinar. We are Erudite Reliability Services, and in behalf of the team, I would like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. It has been a while since our last webinar, so this is our third one this year. So if you have missed our previous webinars, you can find the recordings on our YouTube channel. Okay, so today on this webinar, Erudite Reliability Services and Rails Asset Management is proud to announce a strategic partnership aimed at delivering cutting-edge technical training in fleet management. So Rails Asset Management is a leading provider of independent fleet management consulting services in the Australasian region, bringing decades of expertise across various sectors, including government, transport and logistics, mining, oil and gas, construction, agriculture, waste management, and marine. Together, we are dedicated to equipping practitioners and professionals in the field with the necessary skills to enhance fleet efficiency and reliability, ensuring operational excellence across a wide range of industries. This partnership blends Erudite's precision and problem-solving approach with Rail's comprehensive industry insights to offer top-tier training solutions. So once again, welcome to the Fleet Asset Management webinar, an introduction to mobile equipment management. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. So he has more than 35 years of experience in fleet management industry, completed numerous fleet management assessments in Australia and internationally. He has a proven track record at every level of the fleet management profession, consulted to fleets with as little as 10 assets and as many as 10,000 assets. And he mentored countless professionals in contemporary fleet management practices. So everyone, join me in welcoming our speaker for today, Mr. Andrew Rails.
Thanks,
Mr.
Patricia.
Andrew.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the introduction to mobile equipment management. I'm very excited to be delivering this presentation, and look, I'm very passionate about fleet management and really hope you get something out of this presentation. We've left quite a bit of time at the end of the presentation for questions, so please raise your hand during the presentation, or alternatively, we'll answer questions at the end. So let's get going. If you wouldn't mind the first slide, please. Next slide. So just a brief introduction about Rails Asset Management. Look, essentially we provide comprehensive professional independent fleet management consulting services in the Australasian region. And it's to organisations that operate plant vehicles and equipment. And as we'll go through the presentation, you'll see that just about every organisation runs some form of plant vehicle and equipment, whether that be light vehicles, trucks, construction equipment, or mining equipment or boats. Fleet management is a very diverse discipline, and that will come across in the presentation as we go through. So next slide, please. So some of the services that we offer, we do a lot of fleet management best practice studies. And essentially what that means, that can be a very broad approach on every aspect of your fleet management program, or it can be really focused on one specific problem or issue that you have within your organisation. So typically these are done on site. We do provide what we term a fleet management health check, which can be done online. But we do prefer to come on site and talk with all the stakeholders. And as a result, we prepare a report with a clear roadmap for improvement and recommendations. And then we support those recommendations with follow-up support. We do things like we determine optimum replacement cycles for fleet assets, which is essentially determining what is the best time for you to replace your fleet assets. And it's typically done on the basis of total cost of ownership. Something we're getting a lot of call for at the moment is we're developing specifications for the purchase of new fleet assets. So really, before you prepare to go to market, sitting down and determining specifying the correct asset for the intended purpose of that asset. So we're doing a lot of that at the moment. We're finding that, particularly in Australia, for a variety of reasons, lack of internal knowledge, perhaps they don't have the resources available, and we will work with client areas to develop those specifications before they go to market. And similarly, we then will assist them go to market and also do some tender analysis to determine the best asset for their organisation. We also do financial practices review, capital budgeting, capital forecasting, and of course the operational budgets. Something that's really in vogue at the moment is electric vehicles and alternative fuel vehicles. And look, we take a real holistic approach to those assets. It's not just simply a matter of purchasing an electric vehicle. There's a whole lot of infrastructure that surrounds the purchase of an electric vehicle, and a whole lot of factors go into those decisions. So we certainly help a lot of businesses in that area. Fuel management is a big one. Often fuel management is one of your biggest costs in fleet management. So things like fuel theft, technology for managing the dispensing of fuel, fuel management reporting, things like that. And also we provide a lot of fleet management training. That can be as simple as workshop training to workshop staff or workshop supervisor training, or also we offer a 5-day fleet management masterclass, which covers all aspects of fleet management. Next slide, please. This is just a sample of some of our clients. And as you can see, look, we do work a lot with local government organisations in Australia. We work with state government organisations. We've performed a review at the Department of Public Works and Highways in the Philippines, in particular the Bureau of Equipment. A very, very diverse range of fleets operating in a very diverse environment. And we also work with and small clients as well, with as little as 10 assets. And typically, these organisations maybe have only had 5 or 6 assets during their business, but now once they get to 10 or 15 assets, they start to struggle with the management of those assets, and trying to manage those assets takes away the focus from their core business. So that's where we can come in and assist. Next slide, please. So the webinar objectives today, we want to discover the evolution of fleet management practices, particularly, look, I believe there's a real transition happening from traditional fleet management through to modern contemporary fleet management, and that really aligns itself with the introduction of, with the technology now present in fleet assets. So the way we manage modern technical assets is technologically advanced assets is very different to how we manage the old traditional assets. We'll also highlight some key fleet management trends, principles, and best practices. And I'm aiming to, hopefully you'll view fleet management as a complex, multidisciplinary and independent set of activities, and also understand the challenges and opportunities available in fleet management. And next slide, please. So some key considerations for this webinar. I'd like you to consider how the concepts, strategies, and best practices presented in this webinar apply to your organisation. It's certainly true that if you have fleet assets, you own and manage fleet assets, we certainly share fundamental principles and practices. But you'll also notice as we go through the presentation that some of those principles and practices may not apply to your organisation. And I just ask you just to step back and consider, you know, which ones apply to your organisations and which ones you need to pay particular attention to. So also I'd like you to consider who in your organisation needs to understand and support an effective fleet management program. And traditionally, that was probably really done by the workshop department, but I'm a strong advocate that there's many stakeholders in the fleet management business across organisations, and all those stakeholders' needs and considerations need to be considered. So, next slide, please. So, what is fleet management? So, it's the processes and procedures required in order to effectively manage a fleet of plant, vehicles, and equipment. And as I say, that's a very diverse list of assets. That can be something as simple as a push lawnmower. It can be a light vehicle, perhaps a passenger van. It can be a ship, a mining truck, an excavator. It might be something like a trailer which is towed behind another asset. So typically, effective fleet management programs provide fleet assets that are suitable, so they're fit for purpose. That is very important. They're available, so they're available for use by client areas or the organisation when they're required. Certainly reliable, and they can be relied upon. You know, if you look at an organisation, perhaps an ambulance or something where there's lives at stake, then those assets really need to be reliable. They need to be safe for not only the person driving or operating the asset, but all the stakeholders and indeed, in a lot of cases, the general public as well. They certainly need to be cost effective, and that's for all the stakeholders in the organisation. We're starting to see, particularly in Australia at the moment, sustainability. So sustainability has become very important for a lot of organisations with the target set for the reduction of the greenhouse gases, and that's typically set by organisational requirements and regulatory requirements as well. And of course, the last one is compliance. So compliance with government regulations, with manufacturers' requirements, whether that be servicing and maintenance requirements or warranty requirements, etc. The compliance is quite a big topic within the fleet management program. Next slide, please. So in my view, there's two distinct disciplines required for effective fleet management. And the first one is business fleet management, and that involves things like governance and strategy, the fleet administration, the administration of the policy and procedure and processes involved. Certainly information systems and technology management. So that is things like fleet management information system, GPS telematics system, electronic fuel systems, and also how those systems integrate and work together. So done a lot of work in that area, particularly in the practical application of those systems in a fleet management environment. The other one, of course, is customer relationship management, depending on what type of business that you are. But often I refer to customers as even internal customers. If you're a business that has trucks for delivery, perhaps, then the people that use those trucks in that organisation, I view them as customers, and they need to be treated as such. Of course, you've got operations management and things like, although the workshop may maintain those assets, you rely on the drivers and the operators of those assets to do daily check sheets and pre-start checks on those assets. So that's a very key component of fleet management. Of course, financial management. So that's things like the capital budget, capital forecasting, that's depreciation. If you're a business that has hire rates for your assets, if you're hiring them to other people, that all falls under that banner. We've spoken about sustainability and bulk fuel management. Once again, fuel is one of your biggest costs in fleet management, and the management of fuel covers a lot of things, from obviously fuel theft to fuel consumption. It also includes things like contamination control. Modern fleet assets require very clean fuel for them to operate efficiently. And of course, safety, environment and risk. And that really falls under that compliance banner typically. So then we talk about the second major heading, which is asset management. and in particular the maintenance management. That's quite a big subject in its own right. That's the whether your assets are serviced and repaired internally or externally or by a dealer. There's a whole strategy that really falls under that banner of maintenance management. We talk about replacement planning. That is really determining, firstly, what is the ideal time to replace your fleet assets, and then forecasting, typically over a 10-year period, how many assets, based on their current utilisation and or age, when will we replace these assets, and how much does the organisation need to spend in order to replace those assets at the correct time frame. The acquisition and disposal of assets, that's become very important given that fleet assets are very complex now. It's important that you get those specifications right. We're often spending, as little as $10,000, but we can spend also right through to $500,000, $2 million. I'm involved in an acquisition of a landfill compactor at the moment, which is equivalent to about 1.2 million Australian dollars. So that purchase is the largest purchase that this organisation will make, probably for 10 years. So it's really important you get that decision correct, and it really starts with the specification of that asset. Then, of course, the allocation and the utilisation of assets. So allocation is simply who are those assets allocated, and it's underpinned by policy typically around, is that person allowed to take that vehicle home for private use? Are they allowed to drive the asset to and from work? What are the rules around that? And of course, the utilisation really monitors how often is that asset being utilised. And essentially, we're looking to answer the question, does the organisation need that asset, or can we provide that asset in another way? If we're only utilising that asset for a small period of time per annum or per month, we may well be better off hiring that asset in from an external source. Things like fuel cards. So in Australia, it's very popular for organisations to be issued with fuel cards and go to local service stations or petrol stations to fill up with fuel. So obviously there's a big risk there of fraud and misuse of those fuel cards. So putting appropriate policy and procedure in place to manage those fuel cards. Accident management, that's a big topic in Australia and driven by compliance and obviously cost. So really, it can be simple as a vehicle having an accident and looking at it, but it can also extend to be quite complex in that investigation of the accident, having an accident management committee which looks at the reasons why the organisation's having so many accidents, and developing strategies to reduce the incidence of those accidents. Quite popular in Australia is motor pools. So having, instead of perhaps assets being allocated directly to one individual, the assets are put into a pool of vehicles, and then as people require those assets, they can book them out. And once again, that's typically underpinned by technology. Typically, staff members can go online, determine which assets are available at the time that they require the asset, book the asset, and then they retrieve the keys in a number of ways. They can go to an electronic key box, identify themselves, and that box will release only those keys to them, or simply through an app on your phone will open the vehicle and allow access to that vehicle. Look, we've seen a lot of efficiencies gained through a lot of businesses through the use of motor pools. And once again, it really depends on the organisation as to whether it's suitable for your organisation or not. The other one for me that's very important is driver training, licensing and assessment. Australia is largely driven by compliance and the appropriate training and licensing associated. And typically we will check the driver licenses or competencies every 12 months to ensure that they're up to date, and also they have the correct licensing and competencies involved for those assets. So next slide, please. And I've just broken down business management a little bit further. And as you can see, there's a lot of moving parts in fleet management around the business management and the asset management. So look, the foundational things, the organisational structure and how that you manage those assets, whether it's a centralised or a decentralised management program. I'm typically an advocate for a centralised management structure. And that also includes your fleet management strategy and your asset management plan. Your asset management plan really determines, why do we have these assets? How do we plan to use them? What are those assets going to cost us, typically over a 10-year period? What kind of risks are associated to the organisation in owning and operating those assets? Then we look at things like business planning, annual and monthly reporting. Certainly, just leaning back onto my comment around stakeholders being involved in the management of fleet assets, I'm an advocate for fleet management committees, depending on the organisation. And that's a committee where different stakeholders in the business come together to assist in managing the fleet, sorting out problems before they become big problems, setting the strategic direction of the fleet, essentially. Service level agreements, and this is for those businesses that have typically internal stakeholders that use the fleet assets, and a service level agreement can be very simple or very complex. And it can simply say that the fleet management group will provide this fleet asset to you, and we will provide an asset that's fit for purpose, that's regularly maintained and cost effective. And in return, we expect the operators or the drivers, the operational department, to make sure they're looked after, that they bring them in for service and repair, that they complete pre-start checklists, things like that. So once again, service level agreements can be very simple or quite complex depending on the organisation that's using them. Certainly, I'm certainly an advocate for an accountability framework, and that's for everyone involved in the fleet management function, whether that's the fleet manager right through to the mechanic, through to the operational staff. As you can see, things like professional development, external supplier management, KPIs, financial management, policy, procedure and process, insurance, plant hire rates, facilities management, and fleet management information systems. We will touch on that a bit further as we go through, but as you can see, under the banner of fleet business management, it is quite complex and requires a pretty diverse skill set to manage all those functions. Next slide, please. So this is about now fleet, what I term in fleet asset management. And we look at things like under the maintenance management banner, the preventative maintenance program, that's the design and the application of that program. And once again, the PM program really drives the reliability of those fleet assets, so it's very important. The other thing that's important is having a strong defect management program. And what I refer to there is if the driver or the operator of an asset identifies a problem with the asset, there needs to be a strong process in place for them to, one, identify that defect, record the defect, and then report the defect so that the workshop can then rectify that. Also under the maintenance management is things like planning and scheduling. So once again, planning and scheduling very important because the fleet management is typically a business, and a business, we want to provide the assets that are available to the operational areas or to our customers indeed. So planning and scheduling allows maintenance and repairs to be booked in advance. I like a minimum of 2 weeks in advance. So that gives enough time for operational areas to rearrange their resources and, of course, the workshops to arrange their resources in order to complete whatever maintenance is required and do it efficiently and effectively and get that asset back working where it should be. We look at things like parts management, quality assurance, and when I talk about quality assurance, I'm talking about the quality assurance involved with the repair of the asset, but I'm also an advocate around quality assurance for the data collected. That when we do a repair, it's very important to record particular data about the repair, about condition of the asset, etc., and that feeds into the fleet management function. So quality assurance around data is a fairly new thing, particularly in the fleet environment, but it's very important and it's something I'll touch on further in the presentation. Another one is that I will discuss a little bit further is risk-based replacement. So if you're an organisation that's done a 10-year plan and, for example, you need $3 million per year to replace assets, but the organisation can't afford to spend $3 million, then we take a risk-based approach to that replacement. And typically we say, what is the risk to the organisation if we don't replace that asset? And if that asset is a critical asset, then it may have a major impact on the organisation. But if it's something simple, perhaps like a push lawnmower, then the impact is likely to be that the grass grows a little bit longer and it may not have the impact that the critical asset will have. And then we start to restructure the replacement program and start to push those assets out. We've talked about specification development, fleet procurement and analysis, and that's really about doing fleet analysis, the procurement analysis, rather than choosing the best price or the cheapest price for that matter, really looking at what is the best value to the organisation. And once again, I'll touch on that a bit further in the presentation. There's things like registration. So if you have 500 or 1,000 assets in your fleet, managing the annual renewal process for registration can be quite a complex task and quite a big task. We've touched on accident management, routing and scheduling, fuel management, cost-benefit analysis, criticality analysis. So I just wanted to give the audience an idea and just to show them that fleet asset management has really become quite a diverse business and it requires a different skill set than what it traditionally has. Next slide, please. So as evidenced by the list of fleet management activities that we just went through, effective fleet management is very complex and requires a diverse skill set along with robust policy, procedure and process, and typically integrated with appropriate technology. Next slide, please. And we'll just touch on the evolution of fleet assets. It's really the evolution of fleet assets that is largely driving the evolution of fleet management practices. Just referring back to my comment around traditional fleet management versus modern contemporary fleet management. And the implementation of technology and emission standards has noticeably increased the complexity and costs associated with managing fleet assets. And if you look at the asset on the left, obviously that's a very old asset, and there's no electronics involved in that asset. Very simple. Whereas if you look at the Mercedes truck on the right-hand side, a lot of technology involved in those assets, a lot of computers, and they're certainly a very different asset to manage. And the cost involved in the purchase and the maintenance and the management of that asset is gone up considerably, and that's why we're talking about this today. This modern contemporary approach to fleet management. Next slide, please. So if we talk about fleet assets with pre-emissions technology, so a lot of the technology in new fleet assets is being largely driven by the emissions standards, and that's governments mandating that the emissions coming out the tailpipe need to be cleaned up and need to be a certain level. And the electronics and the technology involved is largely to do with the emissions. There's also a safety aspect to it. But if you consider a jeepney, and it's a very good example. They're pretty simple in design and function. They have limited electronics and technology. They can typically be repaired by anyone with simple tools. And in most cases, they can be repaired with simple and or generic parts. Parts can be rebuilt and remanufactured in a lot of cases. Relatively cheap to repair. And they're generally a fairly forgiving asset in how you manage them. So those assets like a jeepney will tolerate, to a certain degree, dirty fuel, poor maintenance practices, tolerate them to a certain degree. And those older assets typically have a limited focus on emissions control that we spoke about and also limited safety features. Next slide, please. Now, if we consider modern fleet assets, and particularly with the post-emissions technology, very complex technology and electronics. I recently had a look at a Volvo truck. It had one central computer and then 32 separate computers around the truck for managing different components of that truck. So now when we consider repairing those assets, often it's required, you need proprietary software required for diagnosis and repair of those assets, meaning that you need to plug in a laptop to do the diagnosis and repair. So simple things like in a jeepney, when you replace the brake pads, you simply replace the brake pads, put it all back together and away you go. Oftentimes now, when you replace brake pads, something as simple as brake pads on a modern asset, you have to plug a computer in and tell it that you've put new brake pads in and recalibrate those brake pads. So a lot of the manufacturers are really trying to lock down their technology, and they want you to take those assets back to the dealer. Some you can buy aftermarket, some aftermarket software, but once again, it requires the purchase of things like either laptops or specialised tools. Typically, my experience has been around $10,000 for those laptops and diagnostic software or code readers or things like that. Certainly, new assets require specialised training for workshop staff. And we're seeing things like Volvo trucks. If you want to send your mechanics to Volvo training, it's typically a 1-week training program. It's quite expensive training, and the mechanics have a test at the end of it. It's a very serious process, and also there's things now. There's limited aftermarket repair parts available, and we're also starting to see that manufacturers are starting to, as an asset gets beyond 10 years old, there's a limited supply of parts, repair parts available for those assets. So organisations now are starting to consider, as we keep our assets past 10 years, limited parts being available really has an impact on how they maintain and repair those assets. So as far as improvements in those assets, certainly the new assets are more efficient, a lot more safety features, a lot better in the emissions department. They have a lot more features and functions which typically weren't available in the old assets. They're certainly more comfortable for the driver, and they typically represent better fuel savings in those assets. And next slide, please. So I just put together this table as an example of pre-emissions technology and post-emissions technology, purely as an example. And if we have a look at a fuel injector, pre-emissions technology was typically a mechanical fuel system versus a common rail fuel system in a post-emissions technology asset. And typically you could buy a mechanical fuel injector for around $200, depending on what asset was. But we're now seeing fuel injectors cost $1,500, anywhere up to $4,000 and $5,000 per injector. So you can see the cost involved. But not only that, when replacing those injectors, you now need to log in via a diagnostic laptop and tell the engine and the computer that you've installed new injectors. So it's not as simple as just pulling an old injector out and putting a new one in. Hence my comments around mechanic training and also diagnostic equipment to manage those. If we have a look now at a turbo, a traditional old style turbo, perhaps would cost $1,000. We're now seeing a lot of assets with variable geometry turbos, and look, $4,000 is not heard of. Can also be $6,000, $8,000, $10,000. So you can see once again the price to repair these assets, not only the parts involved, but the labour and diagnostic tooling required has grown considerably. And the last example, if we look at, say, an exhaust system, a typical old style exhaust system might be $500, where now a diesel particulate filter assembly, which is essentially on the asset to capture those emissions coming out the tailpipe, it's quite common, anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000 and even higher than that. And one of the impacts, and this is going to have a big impact in the Philippines, is diesel particulate filters and modern trucks. They don't like idling. And if I considered the traffic in Manila, for example, and the amount of idling and things that do, there's potentially going to be a few issues to try and manage and work through in the new style of assets. Next slide, please. So we'll just touch on the evolution of fleet assets and workshop practices. As I was saying, technician or mechanic training, it's now a best practice to target 40 hours of technician training annually. That's reasonably common in Australia for that. And that's typically made up of training can be when a new asset is delivered to the organisation, the dealership that delivers that asset will provide familiarization training and maintenance training to the technicians, or it can be very specific training by the dealer, in which case the mechanics need to go to a particular location to do that training. And there's also in Australia some very broad sort of generic training becoming available now. I spoke about the diagnostic tools, and look, it's essentially most of the time they're a laptop running a particular software program, but I advise my client areas to really treat diagnostic tools as an asset unto themselves. And what do I mean by that? It's not simply a matter of just purchasing a diagnostic laptop and leaving it on the shelf. Those assets, they require maintenance. And when I say maintenance, they need to be updated regularly. They need to be charged and maintained. So what I find is a lot of the old school mechanics, perhaps they're not competent. They're competent perhaps in using the laptop, but they don't have the skills to update the software and things like that. So that really needs to be a consideration. A lot of organisations feel that they're going to purchase a diagnostic tool or a laptop, and that's the end of it. They just leave it on the shelf, but that is clearly not the case. There needs to be a little bit of time involved in constantly updating, making sure they have the right program, etc. And it can become quite complex. So once again, mechanic training is not just about working on mechanical things. It can also be about the tooling and the software involved. We spoke before about simple maintenance procedures such as changing brake pads often requires plugging in a computer and recalibrating the brake pads now. And that is, that is quite common. Some assets you need to do that when simply performing an oil change or replacing transmission fluid. You may have to train the transmission how to change. We're also seeing things like, and this one's quite interesting, is dealerships being able to diagnose problems on trucks in particular over the road via laptop. So the truck may be 200 kilometres away, but the dealership can literally log onto that vehicle, onto the management system of the truck, and perform a remote diagnosis. And they can determine what is wrong with the vehicle and then direct that vehicle to the workshop or dealership for rectification of that repair. One thing that I feel the Philippines will have to pay attention to is the management of their fuel supply. The quality of fuel in modern assets is very important, and they will not tolerate dirty fuel. And why I say that is that one way that that the manufacturers has achieved the emissions standards, the emissions requirements, is through the amount of pressure that the diesel is injected into the engine. And the way that they've been able to achieve that is through very tight tolerances in injectors and fuel pumps and things like that. So if you consider, dirty fuel, often in the old days, we would do that by the human eye. But for example, the human eye can see down to, say, roughly 20 microns. That's roughly the width of a human hair. But we're talking about filtering fuel in a lot of cases down to 2 microns, which that contamination is literally not visible by the human eye. So I'm a big advocate for the management of your fuel supply, and so that can involve filtering. The Philippines is a very humid country, which obviously tends to promote water inside fuel tanks or condensation, and then you start to have problems with diesel bug and things like that. So I would say to you that if you're running modern assets, you really need to pay attention to your fuel supply. So and just to finish up on this one, modern assets can be very unforgiving as opposed to the old assets and how you manage them. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about now the evolution of fleet management practices, and we'll just have a look at traditional fleet management to start with. And it's my opinion that fleet management was not really considered a profession until approximately 10 or 15 years ago, and that's the case certainly in Australia. Fleet management was traditionally seen as a back office function and was typically managed by the organisation's best mechanic. And that mechanics, generally their whole focus was on repairing vehicles. But if you consider what we spoke about earlier in the amount of fleet management activities in the business management and the fleet asset management, often your best mechanic doesn't have the required skill set to perform a lot of those functions. So traditionally, fleet management was reactive, and it typically had a fix it when it breaks type mentality rather than being proactive. Typically had paper-based records for things like fuel, location, maintenance schedules, etc. It was typically very time-consuming. Typically, fleet organisations recorded very limited details when they did repairs or in their asset register or things like that. There was no real-time information available. And as a result, there was limited opportunities to optimise your fleet. Processes were inefficient and sometimes led to a loss of data or missed alerts due to human error. And equally, there was limited time available for analysis of data that was available because your best mechanic was typically solely focused on repairing those assets. So, and traditionally, organisations accepted it costs what it costs to own and manage and repair that asset. That was just accepted by the organisation. Next slide, please. So what is strategic fleet management or modern contemporary fleet management? Strategic fleet management is a structured management framework for fleet assets that aligns with organisational requirements. And the principles of strategic fleet management include fleet assets exist to support the delivery of the organisation's objectives. Fleet assets are managed utilising a full life cycle principles, including costs, risks, and the consideration of alternative ways of supplying fleet assets. So essentially what I'm saying there is Just because an organisation has always owned 10 trucks in order for them to complete their business, that may not be the best way to do that. It may well be that they hire those assets or lease those assets, and strategic fleet management considers all that and does some analysis to determine what is the best way of supplying those assets to the organisation. So fleet asset planning is a key fleet asset planning is a key organisational activity that must be undertaken with consideration of available resources, risk, finances, and the external environment outside of the organisation. Responsibility for the management of fleet assets is centralised for accountability and economies of scale, and the full cost of providing, operating, and maintaining fleet assets should be reflected in organisational budgets. Look, I found traditional fleet management people or the organisation didn't pay attention to the cost of managing those assets, and those costs were often hidden and not available. So strategic fleet management is often software enabled and allows the organisation to collect, analyse and report on fleet activities in real time. Next slide, please. So once again, under the banner of evolution of fleet management, where the traditional fleet manager is focused on the current year, the strategic fleet manager is defining a vision for the future, and they're typically looking between 1 and 5 years ahead. Where the traditional fleet manager administers the fleet policy, the strategic fleet manager is constantly refining current policies to ensure alignment with corporate objectives. Where the traditional fleet manager repeats manual tasks, the strategic fleet manager utilises technology to automate tasks and manage by exception. Where the traditional fleet manager is reactive to issues, the strategic fleet manager uses data and performance metrics to anticipate issues and avoid unforeseen issues. Where the traditional fleet manager utilises their operational and technical experience to make decisions, the strategic fleet manager makes data-driven decisions. Whereas the traditional fleet manager tends to avoid technology, the strategic fleet manager embraces technology and reaps the rewards. So next slide, please. So why is it that many organisations do not practice strategic fleet management? Often there is insufficient appreciation of the complexity of fleet management activities within the organisation. The role of fleet management in the organisation is not well understood. Pardon me. The contribution of fleet assets to the organisation's mission is not clear or well documented. And the full cost of managing fleet assets is not known or appreciated. Also, there is insufficient appreciation of the importance of fleet management activities to the organisation. And the fleet is often seen only as a cost and not as a revenue to the organisation. The next slide, please. So organisational fleet management practices are important because they affect the following. So they affect the costs involved in managing the fleet. They affect employee and public safety. They affect customer service and customer satisfaction. They also have a big impact to the organisation's exposure to risk and compliance, as well as employee performance and job satisfaction, and also things like corporate image, reputation and social responsibility. So once again, fleet management doesn't sit in isolation, but it's an integral part of the organisation. Next slide, please. So now I'll just go over some key trends in fleet management. So we've talked about the increasing technology and complexity of new fleet assets. It's certainly increasing the purchase cost of new assets. And I'm seeing, certainly since COVID and in the last couple of years, I've seen a number of occasions where assets had a purchase price of about $350,000 are now exceeding $500,000 purchase price for the same assets. There's increasing lead times for the purchase of new assets. So COVID was terrible, but I'm still seeing certain fleet assets. If you were to place an order today, you may not receive that asset for 2 years' time. So once again, that ability to look forward and consider how that is going to impact your organisation is very important. The new technology is certainly increasing repair costs. There's increasing difficulty in sourcing repair information due to that technology involved in those assets. Sorry, can you just go back, please? Just go, back to the original slide. One more. Okay, so we are finding that a lot of manufacturers are keeping their repair information to themselves and they don't like to share. I suspect that is so that the owners of the assets are forced to take these assets back to the dealership. So the ability to have good relationships with your dealerships and your manufacturers is very important. There's certainly an increasing requirement for mechanic training, which we've spoken about, as well as the increasing need for diagnostic tooling in order to complete those repairs. And also increasing downtime and the cost associated with extended repair time. So I always encourage organisations to consider what is the cost of downtime to that asset. And it might just be that if a truck breaks down while doing a delivery, yes, look, it has an impact, but we often don't consider that you've got upset client areas or customers. The driver of that truck has nothing to do while the asset's broken down. The workshop needs to dispatch a mechanic out to the side of the road. You may need then to tow that vehicle. So the cost of downtime can be huge. And I encourage organisations to keep an eye on their downtime, record the downtime and the costs associated with that. Next slide, please. So some other trends. So organisations are really starting to struggle with the amount of fleet data available. So we used to complain that there wasn't enough data available, but now we're being swamped with data. And really the magic is converting that available data into useful informations and insights and ignoring data considered noise and start managing your fleet by exception. So what that essentially means is for those assets that behave like you expect them to behave, perhaps their fuel consumption is within the correct range, we basically ignore those assets and we really target those assets that are consuming too much fuel or they're unreliable or things like that. So that's what I mean by managing by exception. Organisations are struggling to manage the effects of ageing fleet assets. So things like, ageing fleet assets typically, things associated are large and complex repairs of those assets. We're starting to see the unavailability of repair parts, the increasing cost of maintaining those old assets, poor availability of old assets, and the unable to meet emission standards. So if your organisation is a very green organisation, then those old assets are unlikely to meet current emission standards. Next slide, please. So what are the implications of the current fleet management environment? So we're starting to see a trend, certainly as consultants, that organisations are relying more on external service providers for repairs and maintenance due to the increased complexity of the repairs, and perhaps they don't have the availability of specialist tooling and software internally, or the specialist skills internally to repair those assets. Certainly organisations are seeking out specialist fleet management and advice to determine optimal replacement timeframes, literally when is the best time to replace their fleet assets. They're certainly seeking out information to develop specifications for the purchase of new fleet assets. They're looking for assistance in determining the total cost of ownership of fleet assets, and also for advice on alternative fueled vehicles, things like electric, hybrid, hydrogen, things like that. And the other thing is that they're seeking guidance on the purchase of fleet management software. So I've had quite a bit of experience in not only the purchase of fleet management software, that's only one factor. The fact that you purchase fleet management software does not guarantee a good result. The implementation and practical implementation of that fleet software is really where it all comes together. So for those organisations thinking that they just purchase fleet management software and it's going to solve all their problems, that's simply not the case. It needs to be underpinned by policy, procedure, and that implementation and training process. There's certainly an increasing demand for fleet management training and certification. Next slide, please. Look, I'm just going to go over some best practices. And to me, once that asset's been purchased, it's when you birth that asset. And what I'm referring to is when you bring that that asset into the organisation and you set it up on your asset register. So as silly as it sounds, when I work with a lot of organisations, I ask them what assets that they own. Often they can't produce a list, an accurate list for that matter. So we think we have 10 trucks, or we think we might own this, but there's no. It's very frustrating, and it's often that they don't keep a spreadsheet or a software system or anything like that. I'm also a big advocate for a standard naming convention. So if you consider something like, I believe you call them pickup trucks, something like a Ford Ranger in the Philippines. In Australia, I see organisations refer to them as different things. It could be a pickup truck, a utility, a style side, a single cab. And what I'm saying is potentially none of those naming standards are wrong, but unless you have a standard, then your ability to then report and analyse that information really decreases. So if you were to have two separate people setting up assets in the asset register and they call those assets different things, even though they're the same assets, you've straight away limited your ability to do data analysis on those assets. So I've just included a very basic naming standard. And a naming standard is nothing more than simply a standard way of describing fleet assets. So if you consider, I tend to break them into a class of vehicles. So the first class might be, it's a heavy vehicle and it's a tanker / fuel, and then the category describes what weight rating they sit under. So once again, these can be quite simple or quite complex, but I have developed a standard within my own business, and that just enables you to name your assets in your database so that they can be quickly identified and reporting and analysis can be performed. So creating standardised naming conventions will aid in record searching, maintaining data integrity, and data reporting and analysis. Next slide, please. So another best practice, clearly best practice, is a policy and procedures manual. I work with a lot of organisations that have very, very limited policy and procedures, particularly around how they manage their fleet assets. And that includes things like the way you purchase them, how you maintain them, how you operate them, etc. And those policy and procedures really need to be aligned with the values, vision, mission, goals, and objectives of the organisation. Next slide, please. Certainly in the current environment, fleet management software is become very important, and purchase and implementation of an FMIS, and what I'm referring to there is a fleet management information system, which tends to be different from a GPS telematics system. So within an FMIS system, that holds your asset register or your maintenance schedules. It can include your forward replacement planning for your replacement of your assets. It can include your motor pool management, basically everything that you do with that asset, fuel management, etc. And then your GPS telematic systems tend to be more about location data, perhaps fault codes, things like that. And of course, the magic becomes when you can integrate both of those systems. And then there is a number of good systems on the market now that integrate both those functions. And once again, that FMIS and GPS telematics really is the foundation of strategic fleet management and assists in reporting, analysis of data, real-time location, utilisation, and driver behaviour data. Next slide, please. We've spoken a number of times about optimal replacement cycles, and they really provide an indication of when fleet assets should be replaced and are typically determined by identifying the period of the lowest total operating cost in an asset's life. And this period is typically where the decreasing cost of depreciation and the increasing maintenance costs intersect on that graph. A lot of people tend to think it's a very specific point in time, but it tends to be a period in time. So there needs to be some analysis done and some calculations done to determine that, but it'll typically recommend that, say for a passenger vehicle in Australia at the moment is common, that we replace that asset at 5 years or 120,000 kilometres. Whichever one of those comes first will provide the lowest total operating cost for that type of asset. And that analysis can be then done across all your different asset types, whether that's a light vehicle or a truck or a grader, mining equipment, etc., to determine when is the best time to replace those assets. And then that information can then be used for long-range financial planning for the replacement of your assets. Next slide, please. And this is just really an example of what a long-term fleet replacement plan looks like. And as you can see, in Australia, our financial year runs from the 1st of July and finishes on the 30th of June annually. And essentially, all that this model is predicting how many fleet assets we need to replace in each financial year and what is the cost of replacing those assets. So there will obviously be a replacement cost, there will be a trade-in value of the old asset, and then a net cost of doing that. I work with a lot of organisations that typically have a backlog of assets to be replaced. And if you're in a position that is the case, you have a backlog of assets, then I recommend taking a risk-based approach and have a looking at those assets and considering, probably first of all, what is the criticality of that asset to the organisation? If that asset's not available or broken down, what is the impact to the organisation? Then you can start to rank those assets in priority and determine which ones you need to replace first. So next slide, please. We spoke about, this one's really very important. A lot of organisations in Australia in particular, when they would purchase a fleet asset, they would purchase strictly on the cheapest price. So what was the price that the dealer, they look at the prices of, say, 4 different suppliers and they pick the cheapest price, and that was how they made their decision. However, a best practice and the best way to go about that is what I call a best value tender analysis. And that will consider multiple criteria, things like life cycle costs, the total cost of ownership across the life of that asset, the operational, so is it fit for purpose and does it suit the purpose, the intended purpose for which it's going to operate? We typically do a mechanical evaluation, which will include workshop staff. So you know, things like, has that asset been reliable in our environment? Can we, is there dealership support available for that asset? What's the downtime history of that asset look like? Then we start to look at, we can include things like service, parts, and warranty. One asset may have twice the warranty, for example, than another asset. And what has the support been from the dealership? I know that from history, some dealerships will tell you that they will support that asset when you purchase it, which would be typical salesman's talk. But when it comes down to actually getting the support for the warranty, pretty much non-existent, or they disappear. So that can be another category that can be assessed in your analysis. And the other one that's become quite popular lately is the delivery timing. Okay, so we've found an asset's the cheapest overall cost, but we're going to have to wait 2 years before that asset can be delivered. What impact is that going to have on the organisation? So typically, these categories are set up and they're weighted and then scored by the various stakeholders to determine what is the best asset to purchase for our organisation. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about meter readings, and that's typically expressed in kilometres driven or miles driven or hours operated if it's something like a grader or an excavator. And essentially, meter readings are considered the lifeblood of fleet management. So what does that mean? So meter readings are accurate. Meter readings are essential for identifying when preventative maintenance is due and for the scheduling of that preventative maintenance if you wish to schedule in advance, which is a clear best practice. Meter readings are essential to determine fuel management reporting, particularly around litres consumed per 100 kilometres or litres consumed per hour. And the same goes for utilisation reporting and replacement reporting. So without accurate meter readings, it's very difficult to perform those functions. And as I say, meter readings are really the lifeblood of fleet management. And it's essential that you develop a process to ensure that accurate meter readings are being regularly recorded in either kilometres driven or hours operated. And I have seen paper-based processes whereby operational staff once a week or once every 3 or 4 days ring in their meter readings to the workshop supervisor or the fleet manager, or they deliver them on a piece of paper. Look, best practice really now is that those recordings or those meter readings come off a GPS system. And why do I say that? Because it's an automated process. The accuracy is a lot better than when there's a human being involved or a paper-based process, and you have real-time information, which enables you then to make real-time decisions. Next slide, please. So preventative maintenance. Look, completion of a robust preventative maintenance program is essential for effective fleet management and drives the reliability of the fleet. So a lot of organisations I talk to, they tell me that, yes, we do preventative maintenance, but when I start to dig and ask some questions, they really don't do preventative maintenance particularly well. And look, it can be quite complex, preventative maintenance, particularly with modern assets. So a few tips for success that I'd recommend is you start with the manufacturer's recommendations as a minimum requirement for what you need to do to perform your preventative maintenance. Then you start to adjust the program for your organisational requirements. You may adjust it if your asset's idle for long periods of time. You may shorten your preventive maintenance periods. If you're working in harsh terrain like a very dusty environment, or you're towing heavy loads, then you start to adjust your PM program for those conditions. You really want to schedule your preventive maintenance around organisational requirements. So the more that you can schedule your preventive maintenance to be performed outside of the normal working hours of those assets, the better for all stakeholders. So if your truck's required to be on the road Monday to Friday, 7 a.m. to 4 p.m., a clear best practice is to schedule those PMs outside of those working hours. And once again, from the previous slide, what drives the scheduling of those preventive maintenance is those meter readings, so that you can start to trend how many kilometres those assets do, and then you can start to predict when it's due for service, and you can start to tell the driver it'll be due in 2 weeks, it'll be due in 4 weeks. And that enables all the stakeholders to organise their resources so that you can have a very efficient PM process. Look, a lot of organisations often consider that PMs are all about the workshop only, and it's all about the changing of oil and filters. And look, there is a lot of truth in that, but in my view, one of the key components for a PM program is the driver or the operator of that vehicle. And the reason I say that is because typically PMs are done, say, every 6 months. So once the workshop has completed that preventative maintenance inspection, the workshop will not see that asset for typically 6 months. But your driver or your operator sees that vehicle every day, and they are your eyes and ears on the ground. So as soon as that operator identifies an issue, there needs to be a defect management program in place where they can report that defect and get that defect rectified ASAP. So there's cost implications there, there's downtime implications, and there's also compliance and safety implications around getting those defects completed very quickly and efficiently. So I would encourage you to consider what role your drivers and operators currently play in the PM program, and whether you have a robust program for them for reporting defects and also the management of those defects. It's no use reporting those defects if the workshop is not then rectifying those defects in a reasonable time frame. So I'm definitely an advocate to have check sheets for all items to be inspected or replaced. I'm an advocate for a quality assurance process for your PM program. And you can start simply by saying, look, the workshop supervisor will do a quality inspection of 10% of all the preventative maintenance that we perform. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the workshop supervisor needs to get under the vehicle or do that. It can be simply having a discussion with the mechanic who performed the PM. Oh, how's it going? How did you go with this one? Now, if the mechanic says, oh, it was terrible, I couldn't get the bolts out, I couldn't do this, it took me too long, well, for me, that would trigger off to then investigate further to determine the quality of that PM process. But if the mechanic sort of says upon questioning, oh, look, it was fantastic, it came in on time, it was clean, everything was good, I didn't find any faults, then that is likely to be an acceptable quality assurance process. But it needs to be considered in your environment and how your organisation works. Similarly, I strongly suggest you have a process for mechanics to suggest improvements to your PM program. If you're suffering from poor reliability of your assets, then you need to look at your PM program. So you need to consider the quality of the program, your checklists and what you're checking, how they're being scheduled, but also if you sit your mechanics down and ask them some questions, they will often say to you, every time this particular model truck comes in, we find it has these loose bolts or these, we constantly have to make these adjustments. And often you'll find that those things are not on the PM checklists. So that provides you an opportunity then to adjust your PM checklist and really optimise that process. I'm certainly an advocate for regular reporting and analysis. So I would suggest if you want to consider how effective your PM program is, I would suggest to you that you have a look at your downtime recording and your reporting. Number one, you have a look at your PM program compliance. And what I mean by that is have a look at how many of your PMs are you completing within 10% of being due. So typically you would aim for 95% of all your PMs due to be completed within 10% of being due. So if it's a 10,000 service, that literally means 1,000 kilometres before or 1,000 within 1,000 kilometres after. So that's what I mean by PM compliance. And also you consider your scheduled and unscheduled maintenance. And they're key drivers and indicators of the quality of your PM program. Next slide, please. So we basically just talked about this. I spoke about downtime, which is basically the opposite to availability. It's one and the same thing, and it depends on how you want to record it. So a typical metric for asset availability is that you want 95% of all your assets to be available during normal working hours, or the opposite, if you want to record downtime, is no more than 5% downtime across your entire fleet. We spoke about PM program compliance and scheduled versus unscheduled maintenance. Next slide, please. So in closing, the management of fleet assets is a complex undertaking and requires a multidisciplinary skill set, along with a thorough understanding of the organisation's operating environment, a thorough understanding of the external environment, including regulations, suppliers, etc., and it needs to be supported by robust policy and procedure. Next slide, please. Thank you. And any questions?
All right, so that was our presentation by Sir Andrew. So do we have questions from our audience, from our participants? So while waiting, maybe some of them are still trying to get it all in, Sir Andrew. So we did have some questions from our registration that we would like to probably address. So first one would be what are the new ways to have a proactive maintenance strategy or plan?
Yes. So I think once again, it comes back to, first of all, considering how that asset is going to be used within the organisation, what type of environment it's going to operate in, and what is the impact to the organisation if that asset breaks down. They're kind of your first steps. Then, of course, manufacturers' requirements are your first port of call for your PM checklists. But you now need to start consider things like, what is the quality of your fuel supply to your fleet assets? You need to consider the quality of the parts that you're putting into those fleet assets. Look, that question, we could do a 2-day session on that subject, and I'm happy for anyone that wants to connect with me on LinkedIn or via mobile. I'm happy to go back and forth a little bit, but you really need to sit down and have a look at your assets and how they're expected to work across the organisation. You need to consider the internal environment and the external environment. So simple questions like, do we have mechanical staff in-house, or are we going to use external suppliers? If we have internal staff, what type of repairs are we going to do? Are we going to do just simply preventative maintenance and small repairs and push all the other repairs externally? What is your overall maintenance strategy? And look at your replacement timeframes. So if you're going to have short replacement timeframes, perhaps you're going to replace your assets every 5 years, your maintenance strategy will look a lot different to an organisation that's going to hold their assets for 20 years. So look, once again, it's quite a big subject, and without knowing the individual organisation, it's probably a little bit difficult to answer.
Okay, thank you for that, sir. Okay, so we have another one. So
Mhm.
I would like to ask, how will you trigger the fleet replacement or retirement? Is this based on the number of years in operations, or is how
Yes. So
meter, or based on the downtime and maintenance costs incurred for the past years?
yes, all of those are correct. So typically, your traditional view would be that you replace your assets by, if I use the example of a truck, you might replace that truck at 10 years or 500,000 kilometres, whichever comes first. Now, if you're an organisation that can afford to replace those assets on optimal replacement cycles, I would highly recommend that. But if you're an organisation that can't afford to replace on those strict guidelines, then yes, I would suggest you consider downtime, you consider maintenance costs, you consider criticality of the asset to the organisation, and you sit down and you simply ask, what is the impact to the organisation if this asset is not available? And those types of questions will help you answer those questions.
Okay, do we have follow-up? Okay. Another one, I got a direct message. So how does fleet management training help with equipment maintenance?
With equipment maintenance or equipment management? Maintenance.
It says here equipment maintenance.
Oh, okay. Look, yes, okay. This one's really close to my heart. Typically, I'll give you an example. Mechanics of a lot of mechanics that I've spoken to in the past have been a little bit upset that they have felt that they've had no input into the replacement of the assets. They consider perhaps that management doesn't pay any attention to them and management just goes and replaces those assets at a time to suit them. But I would totally disagree with that. And the reason I say that is because every detail and every piece of data that is recorded on by the mechanic on a job card directly impacts how those assets will be replaced and maintained. So if the fleet manager is doing some analysis and identifying that one particular asset is breaking down all the time, then that's a trigger then to have a look at the maintenance program and adjust the program so that you eliminate that problem. So what I'm essentially saying is the data that's recorded by the mechanics is extremely important. And if you have a software program to be able to do some analysis, then every piece of data that's recorded by that mechanic has an impact on the cost of the asset, when that asset's replaced, how it's maintained, etc. So, did I answer the question? I'm not sure if I answered the question that was asked.
We got a thumbs up.
Okay,
Oh,
thank
we're
you.
good. Yeah. And then we do have another one. So how do you manage to accurately capture operator's report for breakdown if the said operator is being deployed immediately to another equipment? Most of the time, the report of his immediate superior is not enough, so the breakdown will likely to recur.
Yes, correct. Now that's an internal process, and I will use the word discipline. And what I mean by discipline is if you implement a process, if your internal process is that the operator fills out a check sheet and rings the workshop, for example, or goes through that supervisor, then that process needs to be strictly enforced. That's on a paper based process. But with the introduction of electronic systems now, operators can often fill out their pre-start checks or their defects, report defects via their phone or via a tablet, and then that information is available in real time to the workshop supervisor. So once again, electronically, it's quite an easy process to manage, but if you're in a paper-based environment, it really relies on discipline. So what I mean by that is if your process you have to enforce, and you, as the fleet manager, you have to be prepared to enforce those policies and procedures. And if you're not prepared to do that, then that process is basically useless. Okay, hang on.
Yeah, okay. All right. So my device froze, but luckily I have my teammates here. So I'm moving in screen.
Okay,
Uh,
so once again, I hope I answered that question correctly. I'm happy to chat with anyone offline if need be.
yeah, so that was from Sunny. We do have a lot more from our chat. So we have three questions from her. We do have a few more time to answer it. Is that all right, Sir Andrew?
Okay, so I see one about predictive maintenance. Look, predictive maintenance is a broad term, and to me, it also crosses over into preventative maintenance. It's a bit of a I guess it's a trending term. I guess predictive maintenance, but look, predictive maintenance can be done via oil analysis. So once again, when you sit down and look at your maintenance strategy, that forms a key part of your maintenance strategy, whether you perform oil analysis. Certainly, if you're collecting data and you're able to analyze that data, that will assist you greatly in predictive maintenance. And I say that because you will be able to follow trends within the data. And there's often assets that will be outliers, that will be clearly problem assets that, and you can see that in the data, and that'll enable you to take a predictive approach. It may be predictive maintenance might be simple as just trying to think of an example. You know that on a particular truck doing a particular function, that at the brakes wear out every 100,000 kilometres. So that's a very, very simple form of predictive maintenance. So you can schedule that truck to come in and have its brakes replaced at 100. I mean, that's a very simple form. And once again, it depends on what type of asset we're talking about and what type of environment it is. But I would encourage you to have a look at your overall maintenance strategy to determine what type of maintenance you're going to perform on which asset, and also that then brings in predictive maintenance. Look, predictive maintenance, if you have a GPS telematics system with diagnostic fault codes, they can be, if you're privileged enough to have one of those systems, then a lot of the new systems will send the workshop supervisor a diagnostic code saying that there's a problem with this asset, and that is a form of predictive maintenance. So I notice another question: what software will you recommend to be used to identify patterns of, just one sec, components that usually break down? Look, there is a number of software programs on the market. To me, I think part of that process is I recommend, I'm an advocate for the use of maintenance codes. Now, a maintenance code is simply a way of describing maintenance in standard terms. So typically that's how on your job cards or your work orders, how you describe maintenance, and it's as simple as is it scheduled or unscheduled maintenance? Is it an engine or a transmission repair? What did the mechanic do? They adjusted it or they replaced it. What was the cause of that? So it's basically, a lot of those softwares will do that. It's how you record the data ultimately determines how you can identify those patterns. And once again, this is a subject that we could speak on for 1 or 2 days, and I'm happy to chat to someone offline if need be further about that. I notice there's another question about how we lessen the occurrence of breakdowns due to human factors. I'm assuming you're referring to operators abusing equipment. Would that be correct? Okay, so once again, so the first thing to do is identify that there has been some damage done. That is clearly done by completing regular, and by regular I mean daily pre-start checklists, and making it clear to those staff that so, for example, if someone does a pre-start check sheet today and they've ticked that everything's okay on that asset, then the next day they have a different operator and they identify there's some damage. That is the point at which that damage needs to be noted and reported so that an investigation can take place. And ultimately, if those staff members need to be disciplined, then they need to be disciplined. I see a lot of organisations identify damage, complete pre-start checks, but don't follow through with a HR process. They just allow that damage to continually happen, and they never address the core issue, which is the humans involved. So, look, I don't get me wrong. I appreciate that minor damage can happen, and we certainly, I'm not advocating sacking people, but if there is one operator that's continually causing damage and you have proof, then it needs to be backed up by HR process. Sorry, I'm just to improve fuel efficiency. So there's one here about recommended maintenance activities and best practices and technology to improve fuel efficiency. So look, once again, it starts with a robust preventative maintenance program, and that in conjunction with the 3 performance metrics I spoke about is a good start. Then you need to do regular fuel reporting. So within a group of assets, if they're all the same assets, you can identify immediately which assets are using more fuel than others. And in fact, often the mechanics can tell just by when they service the asset who abuses equipment and who doesn't. But I guess what I'm saying is, if you understand the asset and you perform a criticality of that asset and you understand what role it performs, if you have 2 assets the same performing the same task, and one is consuming 10 litres of fuel per 100 kilometres and one is consuming 20 litres, you have a strong maintenance program in place and you have no known maintenance issues, then it's likely to be the operator at fault. That's the why you're consuming more fuel. The other thing, of course, is fuel management, particularly in Manila, idling. So idle time will have a big impact on your fuel economy. And it's something that's very different, managed very differently across Australia. If you're in a perhaps the lower part of Australia where the temperatures are a bit lower, then what I would recommend, if that asset is going to idle for any more than 5 minutes, to switch off the engine. And that works for a lot of industries. But as you go to northern Australia, where temperatures can be as high as 50 degrees Celsius, then for health and safety reasons, it may not be reasonable to switch the engine off and ultimately the air conditioning. So once again, you need to consider how your organisation views these things, and develop policy and procedure around that, around your organisational requirements. I see another question around fuel allocation and should it be in fuel tank basis. Yes, I'm an advocate for having full fuel tanks filled regularly and full. Once again, I think in the Philippines with the humidity, it kind of promotes condensation in your tanks if your tanks are always empty, and obviously that moisture in the tanks leads to maintenance problems and ultimately failures.
Okay, so that answers the question. Do we have more from our participants? Right, so I guess not. So if there are no more questions, or if you are still thinking about it, don't
Hello.
worry. Yeah. Yes,
Excuse
sir.
me. Yes, Jason from Pilmico. Hi, Andrew. I just would like to ask, do you by any chance have any idea about new technologies um, in the metering? Like, for example, capturing odometers. We in our industry, in our company, by the way, we have forklift units. So we're trying to integrate data collection and have it integrated to our CMMS. We use SAP, by the way.
Okay.
So are there recent technologies about capturing this information, like the running hours or the odometer?
Absolutely. So, look, GPS telematic systems are the probably the primary way of doing that now. And look, there's many different providers of GPS telematic systems. The cost is actually coming down, regularly coming down for the purchase of those types of systems, and they can collect those meter readings one of two ways. If available, they can bring those meter readings directly off the CAN bus or directly across from the computer of the asset, or the GPS telematics system knows a couple of things. It knows when the engine was started, and it also knows when the asset moved and what distance. So it can actually do a calculation behind the scenes and provide those meter readings to you. If it uses the second type, you may find that every month the meter reading may be 10 or 20 kilometres out, as in inaccurate. That's due to the mapping of those documents, but that is very easily rectified. Once that asset comes in for maintenance, you can just readjust that meter reading. But look, there's many suppliers of GPS telematic system, and I'm also aware that there's quite a few in the Philippines as well.
I'm sorry, was that GPS telematic system?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. Thank you.
No problems. Thank you.
Any more questions?
I might just take the opportunity while we're waiting for questions. I just want to thank everyone for their attendance. I do appreciate that we've gone through a lot of information today, and it's probably a lot to take in. I do appreciate that. But at the same time, I wanted to demonstrate how diverse and complicated that fleet management can be. And so really, we only had an hour and a half to do this. And so I appreciate everyone's attention and all the questions. And if you want to chat offline, you can connect with me via LinkedIn or something like that. I absolutely love fleet management, so more than happy to have a chat with you. And look, in the future, we plan on running a fleet management masterclass, probably in Manila, in conjunction with Erudite, and it's probably likely to be a 5-day fleet management masterclass where we'll really go into depth regarding a lot of the topics that we covered, and we can address a lot of those additional concerns that you have.